The midnight air exploded with the thunderous beat of a drum that should not exist, and 12-year-old Keen bolted upright from his mat as sweat poured down his trembling body like river water during the rainy season. The sound crashed through the village of Amana like angry thunder splitting the sky, and every soul within 10 miles knew something evil had awakened from its ancient sleep. Keen pressed his small hands against his ears, but the drumbeat pounded through his bones and into his very soul as if the spirits themselves were trying to claw their way into his heart. His grandmother Maman Kem, who had raised him since his parents died in the Great Flood 3 years ago, was already on her knees praying to the ancestors with tears streaming down her weathered face. The other villagers were screaming and running to their homes, slamming their doors and windows shut as if thin wood could protect them from whatever dark force had chosen to visit their peaceful community tonight. "Keen, my child, come away from that window right now," Maman Kem whispered with her voice shaking like leaves in a storm as she grabbed his thin arm and pulled him toward their small corner where they kept their sleeping mats. The drumbeat continued its relentless rhythm, and with each strike Keen felt something deep in his chest responding to the call as if his own heartbeat was trying to match the mysterious sound. Through the gaps in their wooden walls he could see other families huddled together in prayer, while the brave men of the village gathered outside with their machetes and hunting spears, talking in hushed urgent voices about what they should do. Chief Akwa, the eldest man in Amana, stood in the center of the group with his white beard trembling as he spoke about the old stories his grandfather had told him about drums that played themselves in the dead of night. The fear in the air was so thick that Keen could taste it on his tongue like bitter kola nuts, and he wondered why he felt more curious than terrified when everyone else seemed ready to flee into the forest. As the drumbeat grew louder and more insistent, Maman Kem began to tell him the story that every child in their village knew but hoped never to experience firsthand. "Long ago, before your great-grandfather was born, there was a king named Isnwachukwu who ruled these lands with wisdom and strength until his own brother Okachukwu betrayed him for a bag of cowrie shells and a promise of power from enemy warriors," she whispered while rocking back and forth like she always did when the old pain visited her heart. The drumbeat seemed to pulse with anger as she continued her tale about how the betrayed king was murdered in his sleep and buried in the forbidden forest with his sacred drum so that his spirit would never find peace. According to the legends passed down through generations, the drum would only play when great injustice was about to befall the village or when someone with a pure heart was called to right an ancient wrong. Maman Kem pulled Keen closer to her chest, and he could smell the palm oil and bitter leaf soup that always clung to her wrapper as she begged him to promise that he would never follow the sound of that cursed drum, no matter how strongly it seemed to call to his young heart. But even as Keen nodded his head and whispered his promise to stay safe, his feet were already itching to run toward the source of that hypnotic rhythm that seemed to speak directly to something wild and brave deep in his soul. The other children in the village had always teased him for being the orphan boy who lived with his grandmother and wore the same torn shirt every day, but tonight he felt like the drum was calling specifically to him, as if it recognized something special about his spirit that others could not see. His stomach growled with the familiar pain of hunger because they had not eaten anything since yesterday morning when a kind neighbor shared some leftover yam porridge with them, but the drumbeat made him forget about food as it filled his mind with images of ancient kings and golden treasures hidden in the depths of the forbidden forest. Through the small window he could see the full moon hanging in the sky like a giant eye watching over their village, and he wondered if the spirits of his dead parents were somehow connected to the mysterious music that had awakened every soul in Amana from their peaceful sleep. The drumbeat suddenly stopped, and the silence that followed was more terrifying than the loudest thunder because it meant that whatever force had been calling to them was now waiting for someone brave enough or foolish enough to answer its ancient summons. Maman Kem relaxed her grip on his arm and began to whisper prayers of gratitude to their ancestors for protecting them from whatever evil had been prowling around their village, but Keen felt a deep disappointment in his chest as if something important had been taken away from him before he could fully understand what it meant. The men outside were still talking in worried voices about posting guards around the village and whether they should send a messenger to the neighboring town to ask for help from their medicine man, but young Keen was already planning how he would sneak out of their small hut when his grandmother finally fell asleep. He had lived his entire life being told what he could not do and where he could not go, but tonight the drum had spoken to his heart in a language that seemed more real than all the warnings and fears that the adults used to keep him trapped in their world of limitations and poverty. Comment below and let us know if you think Keen should follow the mysterious drum or listen to his grandmother's warning. 2 hours after midnight, when the village had finally settled into an uneasy sleep, the drumbeat returned with a vengeance that made the ground beneath Keen's feet vibrate like the earth itself was dancing to an ancient rhythm. This time the sound was different, more urgent and personal, as if it was no longer calling to the entire village but speaking directly to one small boy who had been chosen for a purpose that he could not yet understand but felt in every fiber of his being. Keen lay perfectly still on his mat, listening to his grandmother's soft snoring while his heart hammered against his ribs with a mixture of terror and excitement that made his whole body tremble like a leaf caught in a powerful wind. The moonlight streaming through their window seemed brighter than before, and he could swear that he saw shadows moving outside their hut in patterns that matched the hypnotic beat of the mysterious drum that refused to let him sleep. Against every promise he had made to Mom and Kem and every warning that echoed in his mind, Keen slowly rose from his sleeping mat and crept toward the door with his bare feet making no sound on the packed earth floor. His grandmother had always been a light sleeper ever since the night his parents died, but tonight she seemed to be under some kind of spell that kept her in a deep, peaceful slumber despite the thunderous music that filled the air around them. As he carefully lifted the wooden latch on their door, Keen whispered a quick prayer to his ancestors, asking them to forgive him for disobeying the woman who had sacrificed everything to keep him alive and to protect him on whatever journey the drum was calling him to take. The cool night air hit his face like a gentle slap, reminding him that he was wearing nothing but his old shorts, but the drumbeat seemed to warm his blood and give him strength that he had never felt before in his 12 years of struggling to survive as the poorest child in their village. The moment Keen stepped outside, he could see that he was not the only person who had been unable to resist the call of the ancient drum, because scattered around the village square were at least 6 other people standing in the moonlight with their faces turned toward the forbidden forest like sleepwalkers following a dream. There was Adiz, the blacksmith's daughter, who was known for her fierce temper and stubborn spirit, standing near the old Irako tree with her arms stretched out toward the forest as if she was trying to embrace something invisible. Old Papa Chike, who had been the village storyteller for over 60 years, was shuffling slowly toward the forest path with his walking stick tapping against the ground in rhythm with the drumbeat while his mouth moved in what looked like a conversation with someone only he could see. Most shocking of all was Chief Aqua's youngest son Emeka, who had always been too proud to speak to poor children like Keen but was now walking barefoot across the village square with tears streaming down his face, as if the drum had broken through his family's wealth and status to touch something raw and honest in his heart. But as Keen watched the other villagers moving like spirits toward the forest, he noticed something that made his blood run cold with a fear deeper than anything he had ever experienced in his short, difficult life. Each person who was following the drum's call had their eyes closed and their faces blank, as if their souls had been pulled out of their bodies, leaving only empty shells, walking toward whatever fate awaited them in the darkness. When he tried to call out to Adiz to ask if she was all right, no sound came from his throat, and he realized with growing horror that the drum might be controlling everyone except him, which meant that he was either blessed with special protection or cursed to watch helplessly as his neighbors walked into danger. The drumbeat grew more intense and urgent, as if it sensed his resistance and was trying harder to pull him under its spell, but Keen found that he could still think clearly and make his own choices, even though every instinct in his body was screaming at him to follow the hypnotic rhythm that promised answers to questions he had been carrying his whole life. As the group of enchanted villagers disappeared into the tree line at the edge of the forbidden forest, Keen had to make the most important decision of his young life, because he knew that if he followed them he might never return to his grandmother's loving arms, but if he stayed safe in the village he would spend the rest of his days wondering what secrets the drum had been trying to share with him. The moonlight seemed to form a silver path leading directly to the spot where the others had vanished, and he could hear the faint sound of voices singing in harmony with the drumbeat, as if the forest itself had come alive with ancient music that had been sleeping for generations, waiting for the right moment to awaken. His stomach twisted with hunger and fear, but his feet began moving forward without permission from his mind, as if his body understood something that his brain was still trying to figure out about destiny and courage and the price that must be paid for knowledge that could change everything. Subscribe to our channel if you're ready to discover what waits for Keen in the Forbidden Forest, because the next part of this story will reveal secrets that have been hidden for over 200 years. The Forbidden Forest swallowed Keen whole like a giant mouth closing around a morsel of food, and within 3 steps of crossing the tree line he found himself in a world so different from his village that he wondered if he had somehow been transported to the land of the spirits. Ancient trees towered above him like the pillars of a cathedral built by the gods themselves, and their branches formed a canopy so thick that the moonlight could only penetrate in small silver patches that danced across the forest floor like coins scattered by a careless traveler. The drumbeat that had seemed so loud and overwhelming in the village now sounded muffled and distant, as if it was coming from somewhere deep underground, and the silence between each rhythmic pulse was filled with strange whispers and the rustle of unseen creatures moving through the shadows. Keen's bare feet sank into a carpet of fallen leaves that felt warm and alive beneath his toes, and he could smell the rich earthy scent of growing things mixed with something else that reminded him of the incense his grandmother burned during her prayers to the ancestors. As he stumbled forward through the maze of massive tree trunks and hanging vines, Keen began to notice that he was not alone in this enchanted wilderness, because he could hear the voices of the other villagers somewhere ahead of him singing in languages that sounded ancient and powerful, even though he could not understand the words they were chanting. The melody they created wove itself around the drumbeat like golden thread, binding everything together in a tapestry of sound that made his heart swell with emotions he had no names for and his eyes fill with tears that tasted like rainwater and salt. Every few minutes he would catch a glimpse of white clothing or hear the shuffle of bare feet on the forest floor, but whenever he tried to call out to Adiz or Papa Chike or any of the others, his voice would be swallowed by the thick air before it could travel more than a few feet from his mouth. The deeper Keen ventured into the forbidden forest, the more he began to understand that this was not just a collection of trees and animals, but a living, breathing entity that had been watching over his village for countless generations while keeping secrets that were older than memory itself. Strange flowers bloomed on bushes that glowed with their own inner light, casting an eerie blue radiance that made everything look like it was underwater, and when he reached out to touch one of the luminous petals it crumbled to dust in his fingers, leaving behind a scent that reminded him of his mother's cooking on the last day he had seen her alive. The path he was following seemed to shift and change when he was not looking directly at it, as if the forest was gently guiding him toward a specific destination while making sure he did not get lost or stumble into areas where a 12-year-old boy might encounter dangers too great for his young spirit to handle. After what felt like hours of walking through this supernatural landscape, Keen suddenly emerged into a circular clearing where the canopy opened up to reveal the full glory of the star-filled sky above, and in the center of this sacred space sat the most magnificent sight his eyes had ever beheld. The drum that had been calling to him all night was easily as tall as a grown man and made from wood so dark and polished that it seemed to absorb the moonlight rather than reflect it, while the animal skin stretched across its surface was decorated with intricate patterns that seemed to move and shift like living tattoos telling stories of ancient kings and forgotten battles. Around the drum in a perfect circle sat the enchanted villagers with their eyes still closed and their mouths open as they continued their otherworldly singing, but now Keen could see golden threads of light connecting each person to the drum, as if their very life force was being drawn into the ancient instrument to power whatever magic had brought them all to this place. Standing beside the magnificent drum was a figure that made Keen's knees buckle with awe and terror, because even though the man appeared to be made of translucent light and shadow, there was no mistaking the royal bearing and noble features of someone who had once commanded the respect and loyalty of an entire kingdom. The ghostly king wore robes that sparkled like starlight and a crown made of what looked like crystallized tears, while his eyes held the deep sadness of someone who had been betrayed by those he trusted most, but also the fierce determination of a warrior who refused to accept defeat even in death. When the Spirit King noticed Keen standing at the edge of the clearing, those ancient eyes locked onto his with an intensity that made the boy feel like every secret thought and hidden dream in his heart was being examined and weighed by someone who understood the true meaning of courage and sacrifice. Hit that like button if you're as amazed as Keen by this incredible revelation, because what the Spirit King tells him next will completely change how you think about justice and forgiveness. So you are the one my drum has been calling. The Spirit King spoke with a voice that sounded like distant thunder mixed with the whisper of wind through dry leaves, and Keen felt the words settle into his bones like warm honey, filling every empty space in his hungry soul. The ghostly figure of Iznwachukwu moved closer to the trembling boy, and with each step the ground beneath the king's feet bloomed with flowers that glowed like tiny stars before fading back into ordinary earth, as if nature itself was responding to the presence of this ancient royal spirit. Keen wanted to run or fall to his knees or scream with terror, but instead he found himself standing perfectly still as the dead king's luminous hand reached out to touch his forehead, and suddenly his mind was flooded with visions of the past that felt more real than his own memories. He saw the great betrayal that had ended the king's life and witnessed the moment when Okachukwu had driven a poisoned dagger into his brother's heart while whispering false words of love and loyalty that would echo through the generations like a curse that could never be broken. The Spirit King's touch filled Keen with knowledge that no 12-year-old should possess as he experienced the weight of ruling a kingdom and the pain of discovering that the person you trusted most in the world was willing to murder you for a handful of gold and the empty promise of power. For over 200 years I have been trapped in this drum waiting for someone with the courage to face the truth about what happened on the night I died and the wisdom to understand that justice is not the same thing as revenge, the king explained while his sad eyes searched Keen's face for signs of the strength that would be needed to complete the task that lay ahead. The enchanted villagers continued their haunting song, but now Keen could understand that they were not under a spell but had been chosen as witnesses to whatever test or ritual was about to unfold in this sacred clearing where the boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the ancestors had grown thin enough for old wrongs to finally be made right. As the night wore on and the moon reached its highest point in the star-scattered sky, the Spirit King began to tell Keen the full story of his life and death and the terrible price that the village of Amuna had been paying for his brother's betrayal without even knowing it. Every generation since my murder has suffered from poverty and misfortune because the land itself mourns for the justice that was never served and the truth that was never spoken, Nwachukwu said with such profound sadness that Keen felt tears streaming down his own cheeks as if he was crying for all the hungry children and struggling families who had lived and died in ignorance of the curse that had been cast upon their home. The king explained that his drum could only be silenced and his spirit finally laid to rest if someone pure of heart was willing to beat the ancient rhythm that would call his brother's ghost back from whatever dark corner of the afterlife he had been hiding in for 2 centuries and force him to face the consequences of his terrible crime. But the test that the Spirit King described was not something that any ordinary person could survive because it would require Keen to open his heart completely to the pain and rage and betrayal that had been trapped inside the drum for so long while maintaining enough strength and clarity to find the rhythm that would restore balance to the spiritual world. If you fail in this task, your soul will be pulled into the drum to keep me company for eternity, and the curse on your village will grow stronger with each passing year, the king warned while his ghostly form began to fade in and out like smoke being blown by an invisible wind. The singing villagers started to sway back and forth as if they could sense that the moment of truth was approaching, and their golden threads of connection to the drum grew brighter and more vibrant as they prepared to channel their combined life force into whatever magic was about to be unleashed in this sacred space. Keen looked around the clearing at the faces of his neighbors and friends who had been drawn here by the same mysterious call that had awakened him from his sleep, and he realized that he was not just making a choice for himself but for everyone in Amuna who deserved to live free from the shadow of an ancient injustice that had been poisoning their lives for generations. His grandmother's loving face appeared in his mind along with memories of all the nights they had gone to bed hungry and all the times other children had mocked him for being poor and orphaned, and he understood that this moment was his chance to transform not just his own destiny but the fate of every person who called his village home. The Spirit King held out his translucent hand toward the magnificent drum and waited for the small boy to make the most important decision that any human being could ever face, while the forest itself seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of what would happen next. Make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell because the final part of this incredible story will reveal whether Keen has what it takes to break a curse that has lasted for over 2 centuries. With hands shaking like leaves in a hurricane, Keen approached the towering drum that seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, and the moment his small fingers touched the ancient wood, he felt a jolt of electricity shoot through his entire body as if he had been struck by lightning made of pure ancestral power. The drum's surface was warm and alive beneath his palms, and he could feel the trapped soul of the murdered king flowing through the instrument like blood through veins, while whispered voices of countless generations urged him to find the courage that had brought him this far and use it to heal wounds that had been festering in the spiritual realm for far too long. Behind him the enchanted villagers began to hum in harmonies so beautiful and haunting that even the night birds fell silent to listen, while their golden threads of connection grew brighter and started weaving together into a net of light that surrounded the entire clearing like a protective barrier against the dark forces that would try to stop what was about to happen. As Keen raised his hands above the drum and prepared to strike the first beat that would either save his village or doom his soul to eternal imprisonment, he felt the presence of his dead parents standing beside him with their loving hands on his shoulders, giving him strength that no living person could provide. The spirit of his father Chinedu whispered words of encouragement that made tears stream down his face while his mother Adana sang the lullaby she used to hum when he was frightened by storms or bad dreams, and their combined love formed a shield around his heart that would protect him from the worst of what was coming. With a deep breath that tasted like freedom and fear mixed together in equal measures, Keen brought his palms down on the drum with all the force his young body could muster, and the sound that erupted from the ancient instrument was like the roar of 1,000 lions mixed with the crash of ocean waves against cliffs of stone. The first beat sent shockwaves through the forest that made the giant trees sway as if they were dancing to music only they could hear, and suddenly the air in the clearing began to shimmer and twist as a doorway opened between the world of the living and the realm where guilty spirits hide from judgment. Through this supernatural portal stepped a figure that made even the brave Spirit King take a step backward, because Okachukwu the betrayer had spent 2 centuries marinating in guilt and rage until he had become something far more terrifying than any ordinary ghost or ancestor spirit. His form flickered between the handsome prince he had once been and the twisted demon his jealousy had transformed him into, while his eyes burned with the green fire of envy that had consumed his soul on the night he murdered his own brother for a throne he was never worthy to occupy. "Brother," the evil spirit hissed with a voice like breaking glass as he materialized fully in the clearing and fixed his burning gaze on the luminous figure of the king he had killed so long ago. "Still playing your pathetic drum and crying about justice like the weak fool you always were, even when we shared our mother's womb." But King could see that beneath all the bluster and hatred Okachukwu was terrified of finally facing the consequences of his terrible crime, because his ghostly form kept trying to retreat back through the portal even as the drum's magic held him trapped in the sacred space where truth could not be avoided or denied any longer. The boy continued to beat the ancient rhythm that his heart somehow knew by instinct, while the Spirit King began to speak in a voice that carried the weight of 2 centuries worth of pain and the unshakable authority of someone who had been wronged but never broken. The confrontation between the 2 royal brothers filled the clearing with energy so intense that the very air seemed to catch fire, while King poured every ounce of his strength and will into maintaining the drumbeat that was keeping the portal open and forcing the guilty spirit to remain and face judgment for his crimes. Through the music he could feel the curse that had been choking the life out of his village beginning to crack and crumble like old clay as the truth about the ancient betrayal finally came into the light after being buried in darkness for so many generations. Okachukwu's form began to shrink and fade as the power he had gained through murder and treachery was stripped away by the pure sound of justice being served, while the Spirit King grew brighter and more solid with each beat of the drum until he looked almost alive again despite having been dead for over 200 years. When the evil brother finally confessed his crimes and begged forgiveness for the pain he had caused, Keen felt a tremendous weight lift from his shoulders as if he had been carrying a burden he did not even know existed, and the curse that had been poisoning his village dissolved like morning mist touched by the first rays of sunlight. The Spirit King placed his glowing hand on the boy's head and spoke words of blessing that would echo through his bloodline for generations, while the magnificent drum began to crack and crumble into dust that sparkled like diamond powder before being carried away by a wind that smelled of rain and new beginnings. The enchanted villagers opened their eyes and looked around in wonder as if waking from a beautiful dream, while golden light filled the clearing and then slowly faded as the portal between worlds closed forever and the balance between justice and mercy was finally restored. 3 days later, when Keen returned to his village, he found that everything had changed in ways both magical and practical, because the curse's lifting had brought prosperity and good fortune that would transform Amana from a struggling community into one of the most blessed places in all of West Africa. His grandmother Maman Kem wept with joy when she saw him walking up the path with a bag of gold coins that the grateful Spirit King had given him, and she listened in amazement as he told her about his incredible adventure in the forbidden forest that was now just an ordinary woodland where children could play safely among the trees. The other villagers who had been called to witness the ancient ritual remembered only fragments of what had happened, but they all agreed that something wonderful had occurred and that young Keen had somehow been chosen to bring healing to their community in ways they might never fully understand but would always be grateful for. Comment below and tell us what you learned from Keen's incredible journey, and don't forget to subscribe for more amazing African stories that will inspire your heart and expand your mind, because courage and kindness are the greatest treasures any person can possess.